This is the story of Pata Seca, the enslaved man who was forced to father more than 200 children for his master. He is remembered not for the love he gave, nor the family he chose, but for the hundreds of children he was compelled to create. While others bent under the lash and the weight of sugarcane, Pata Seca's suffering took another form. His very body was turned into a weapon of slavery. But how could one man become both a legend and a prisoner of his own flesh? And what happened when freedom finally came? To understand his story, we must step inside one of the darkest chapters of Brazil's past: slave breeding. By the early 19th century, the world was changing. In 1808, the transatlantic slave trade was banned by the United States and Britain. Brazil followed with its own ban in 1831. On paper, this should have marked the beginning of the end, but greed has always found a way. Brazil was the largest importer of African slaves in the Americas. Over 4 million enslaved people were brought to its shores, more than to any other country. Even after the trade was outlawed, slave ships continued to arrive illegally, smuggling thousands more across the Atlantic. But slowly, that stream began to dry up. Meanwhile, Brazil's economy exploded. Sugar, cotton, rice, and later coffee demanded more labor than ever before. The fields stretched for miles. Mortality among slaves was high. Supply could not keep up with demand. The solution was as cruel as it was calculated. Treat enslaved women as breeders and enslaved men as studs. Families were broken, intimacy was stolen, and reproduction became a business strategy. Owners began speaking of good stock, of women who could produce, of men whose seed was valuable. They applied the same language used for cattle and horses, stripping away the last remnants of humanity. This practice wasn't whispered about, it was institutionalized. Enslaved men and women were forced together against their will. Superstitions flourished. Tall men were thought to sire strong sons. Women were judged by their hips and fertility. Every birth was a profit margin, every child a future laborer. It was within this world that the legend of Roque José Florêncio, known as Pata Seca, began. Pata Seca was born in Sorocaba, Sao Paulo, in the early 19th century. His real name, his parents, his early life, most of it was swallowed by history. What survived was his towering figure, 7 feet 2 inches tall, with long, thin legs, massive feet, and oversized hands. Among the enslaved, he was nicknamed Pata Seca, dry paw. The name carried both familiarity and cruelty. Enslaved people were often given animal names, as if even their identities could be mocked and diminished. But over time, the name stuck, becoming the way generations would remember him. His master, Francisco Bueno, entrusted him with duties uncommon for most slaves. Pata Seca delivered mail, cared for animals, and rode on horseback between towns. Compared to the back-breaking labor of sugarcane, his life might have looked privileged. Some may have envied him. But his true assignment revealed the sinister logic of slavery. Pata Seca was not spared the fields out of kindness. He was reserved for breeding. His unusual size, his frame, his endurance, even his superstition-marked long legs, all of these made him valuable. And so, his body was conscripted into a different kind of bondage. Unlike most slaves, Pata Seca was fed well, monitored for disease, and carefully maintained. Not out of compassion, but out of investment. His body was capital. Slave owners believed tall men would produce tall sons, and tall sons could lift heavier loads, walk longer distances, and survive harsher conditions. By this twisted arithmetic, Pata Seca was priceless. He was forced to sleep with enslaved women chosen by his owner. How many? We cannot know. Some say hundreds. His descendants estimate that over 200 children came from his forced unions. Entire districts, like Santa Eudoxia in São Carlos, trace nearly 1/3 of their population back to him. He became not just a man, but a bloodline, multiplied by force. But if outsiders thought his life easy, they misunderstood. Every child born was another soul he could never claim. Every face was a reminder of love stolen, of fatherhood denied. To some, he was enviable, to others, pitiable. But to himself, perhaps he felt like a shadow, a man living many lives but owning none of them. The children of Pata Seca did not share his privileges. They were born into chains as property of the master. Some were sold away before they could walk. Others remained, only to be put to work as soon as their hands could grip tools. There were no birthdays, no childhood games, no schools. Education was forbidden, laughter was dangerous, and innocence was stripped away. They labored in fields under the scorching sun, planting and harvesting for hours until their small bodies collapsed. Some were sent into homes as servants, tasked with cleaning, cooking, or tending to the children of the very families who enslaved them. Punishment came quickly. Whippings, beatings, and humiliation for the smallest mistake. Mothers wept quietly as their babies were torn from them. Fathers, if they were even allowed to acknowledge them, looked on helplessly. For Pata Seca, this must have been agony. He walked past children who bore his features but could never call him father. His body created life, but the system denied him family. This was his paradox, envied by some, pitied by others, and yet shackled in ways no whip could show. In 1888, slavery was finally abolished in Brazil, the last country in the Americas to end the practice. For millions, freedom came late and uncertain. For Pata Seca, it meant land. His master, perhaps out of gratitude for his service, granted him a plot of land in Santa Eudoxia. Here, at last, he could choose his own path. He married a woman named Palmyra. Together, they raised 9 children in freedom, children he could love, hold, and protect. He worked the land, producing rapadura, a raw cane sugar. Though his earnings were small, he poured them into his family, building something that was finally his. But even in freedom, the shadow remained. He had 9 children he could raise, and more than 200 he could not. Their names were never recorded, their faces blurred into the fields. He searched, but there were no documents, no markers. They were lost to time, scattered by the cruelty of a system that reduced them to property. Imagine the weight of that knowledge, to walk through life surrounded by descendants you could never know, to live 130 years and never meet most of your children. On June 13, 1958, Pata Seca died in Santa Eudoxia at the remarkable age of 130. He had lived long enough to see empires fall, republics rise, 2 world wars fought, and slavery fade into memory. He was buried with honor, a monument raised in the town where his descendants still walk today. But his legacy is not only one of survival, it is also a mirror. Entire communities exist today because one man's body was weaponized. His descendants are living proof of both resilience and violation. Pata Seca's life reveals a truth often buried. Slavery was not just about chains and whips. It invaded the most intimate parts of life. It turned love into transaction, family into strategy, and children into capital. Pata Seca's name carries 2 legacies. On one hand, he was remembered as strong, tall, legendary, the father of a village. On the other, he was a man whose humanity was stolen, whose children were taken, whose story became a symbol of slavery's cruel efficiency. He is a reminder that slavery did not simply exploit labor. It reshaped lives, twisted families, and commodified even the most personal bond between parent and child. In every crop he planted, In every descendant who still bears his blood, Pata Seca remains. His story is a warning that systems of oppression do not just take your freedom, they take your humanity.